Hi everyone, and welcome to this assessment briefing webinar aimed at supporting you with completing assessment 7020 as part of your CMI Level 7 Coaching and Mentoring Certificate. I'm Karen, an Associate Coach and Learning Facilitator, and I support BOO Coaching in delivering CMI Coaching and Mentoring programs. So the aims of this session are to help you understand the learning outcomes and assessment criteria for 7020, understand how you might go about researching your assessment, talk a little bit about how to structure and present your assessment, and then finally we'll talk about word count. If you've watched one of these other assessment briefings, we might cover some of the same contents, but obviously the learning outcomes and assessment criteria elements are going to be different. So feel free to skip over any bits that you've already seen and you feel confident with, but they might serve as a good reminder. So Assessment 7020 is about developing the skills and practices that support coaching and mentoring activity across the organisation. And as per the last assessment that you've done, so 7015, it covers both coaching and mentoring, and it's designed to consider both of the practices within the organisational context. And for this particular assessment, there are 5 learning outcomes. So these are to understand how coaching and mentoring programs support business objectives, so a little bit similar to what you might have done in 7015. Understand how to implement coaching and mentoring. So it's a little bit more practical, this assessment. There are some activities where you need to demonstrate how you would go about implementing coaching and mentoring in your organisation. And then as part of this, you need to devise an implementation plan. And then the final 2 are about evaluating the impact of coaching and mentoring against the plan. And then lastly, thinking about how to develop skills as a leader in coaching and mentoring. And as you can see, there are quite a number of assessment criteria spread across the learning outcomes. So each learning outcome is broken down into a number of assessment criteria, and you need to pass all of these to pass the assessment. And the assessment criteria cover both coaching and mentoring. And as I mentioned before in one of the other briefings, is that you need to really make sure that you're paying attention to these command verbs here. So where it says, it's usually the first word in the assessment criteria. So for here we've got to evaluate, and then assess, and then develop. So it is quite important that you know what those mean. So you can find a list of the command verb definitions in your candidate handbook on page 33. These words tell you how to address the criteria, and some of the command verbs require higher order skills, so your answer is going to be much more in depth if you are evaluating as opposed to identifying. Some of the common ones in your assessments are assess, evaluate, discuss, explain, and identify. If we have a look at evaluate, so what you need to do here is to consider both strengths and weaknesses, or arguments for and against, or similarities and differences. And you need to look at things from a different perspective and then draw conclusions. And whilst you're doing that, you need to just make sure that you're applying the current research or theories to back up and support your evaluation. This is a little bit different to if you get asked to identify. Here, what you're doing is just identifying the origin, as it says, or nature or definitive characteristics of something. Sometimes you can use listing, so it's less detail in an identify question than there might be in an evaluate question, for example. So the main thing to really take care of is to really pay attention to the assessment criteria. After all, this is what you're going to get assessed against. And just make sure that you're not veering away from the brief, and that you back up your examples with your wider reading and examples from your organisation to really show that you understand what they're asking you for. So the learning outcomes and assessment criteria are organised into an assessment brief, and the idea of this is to make it easy to address the assessment criteria. What you might find is that the assessment criteria from different learning outcomes are organised into one task, so they might be in a slightly different order as to the order that you look at on the syllabus. So it'd be helpful to start your assessment with a brief overview of your organisational context in an introduction, and this won't be included in your word count. If you don't have an organisation that you can write about, if you're not currently employed in an organisation, you might be able to use the scenario that's suggested here, or an organisation that you know well. You can use your own employment context or another organisation that you're very familiar with to base your assignment on. For this particular assignment, you're being asked to imagine that you're a senior manager leading a department. And the plan is that you're going to implement coaching and mentoring to help individual and overall business performance. As well as looking at the assessment brief, you're going to find it really helpful to look at the syllabus. And you can find this on the internet, and we've also emailed this out to all of our learners. This gives you lots of hints and tips within the good practice guidance as to how to address the assessment criteria. It makes suggestions on the different theories you can look at and the content that you might include. I realise it is a really big document, but if you search for the assessment number, you'll soon find the right section to have a look at. So let's have a look at the tasks for this particular assessment. 7020 is organised around 3 tasks, and for each task you need to try and back up your answers with relevant theory and examples from your organisation that you're basing the assessment on. So there are 10 assessment criteria here for task 1. And the word count is around 1,000 to 1,100 words. So what I'd suggest you do is divide the word count between the assessment criteria. So it's roughly 110 words per assessment criteria. But just bear in mind, you might want to give a little bit more detail to those assessment criteria where it's actually asking for a little bit more. So where you've been asked to evaluate, you might allow a few more words for those particular criteria. So don't forget to include examples for both coaching and mentoring, and try and have examples that show both. And you can readily join together some of the assessment criteria where they're covering similar outcomes. For example, it would be quite easy to join together 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 and 1.4 because they're covering similar things. You've actually covered some of similar things in your last assessment, so you might find it useful to have a look back at what you covered here. So looking at the benefits and how coaching and mentoring supports business objectives. There are some really helpful suggestions of the types of benefits that you could include within the syllabus. I won't go over all of those now because you can have a look at those for yourself, but it does suggest sort of things like improvements in communication, the impact on culture, the impact on change management and so on. What you could do is maybe think about comparing coaching and mentoring to other approaches and how might coaching be a beneficial approach rather than another approach, so for example training. This assessment is suggesting that you prepare your answers as a report for other managers, and we'll look at the presentation of your work a bit later on. So don't forget for 1.1 and 1.2 you're being asked to evaluate the benefits, so you might want to think about strengths and weaknesses, arguments for and against, looking at things from different perspective, comparing other approaches, so why might coaching and mentoring be better. So you can see for this task there are quite a number of assessment criteria and the word count is quite tight, so don't forget if you're covering 4 assessment criteria together, you can times that up by the number of criteria. So for the first section, covering 1.1 to 1.4, it'll be around 440 words. You may even need to give a little bit extra because you're evaluating. So let's move on to looking at 2.1 and 2.2. So here you're asked to look at the resource implications of coaching and mentoring. So the kinds of things that you might want to cover here are thinking about staff time to actually do the activities, thinking about whether you're going to be doing training and what the costs are of that training, how you're going to administrate it, and if there are any other sort of housekeeping items it suggests in the syllabus, thinking about things like stationery or costs of launching. So you might have an intranet or something like that, or use your communications team to help you launch a program. So just thinking about the resource implications of both coaching and mentoring, and use around 220 words for this, and you can join the two criteria together. It is a discuss criteria, so when we look at what discuss is asking you to do, it means to give a detailed account with a range of views and opinions and contrasting perspectives. So moving on, let's have a look at 2.3 and 2.4. So here you've got to explain how to overcome organisational and individual resistance to the implementation of coaching and mentoring. Again, join these two criteria together. It isn't explained, so it just means to describe in detail. When thinking about addressing this criteria, you could think about referring to some change management theory to help you get across some of your explanations. So it does suggest in the syllabus a number of different theories. There are lots around change management if you do your research. You'll find plenty on Management Direct, and the ones that are suggested here are Adkar, Cotter, Lewin and the force field analysis. Cotter's 8 steps is particularly helpful because it explains in detail how to go about managing a change. So you could perhaps explain the way that you would implement coaching and mentoring using those 8 steps to overcome some of the things that could get in the way. Some of the things that particularly get in the way of coaching and mentoring might be around competing business pressures. It might be around a lack of investment or availability of funds to invest in coaching and mentoring. It might be around things like a lack of expertise or poor senior management commitment. There is some interesting research by the CIPD on coaching and mentoring and the implementation of both of these that you might want to have a look at. What I'm showing here on the screen now is Management Direct, and as you can see it's got lots of information around the models that we've suggested. So here you can see a nice diagram of Cotter's model and an explanation. And then also another model that's quite useful here is Lewin's force field analysis, and here it's looking at the forces that drive the change and those forces that might resist the change. So this could be a good way of presenting this answer. So really thinking about in detail what are the things that you could do to try and overcome some of those issues. So how can you overcome maybe where it's a lack of expertise? How can you overcome where there might be a lack of investment? How do you convince senior managers to be committed? So just make sure you give enough detail on explaining the areas that you've pulled out. So the last part of task 1 is 4.1 and 4.2. As you can see, it jumps around a little bit if you compare it to the syllabus. So it doesn't exactly follow in order with the numbers of the assessment criteria, and it is just because the assessment criteria sort of fit together. So that's why they do it. It is an evaluate question, so really having to be quite thorough here, showing the impact of establishing a coaching culture. What you might want to do with these particular criteria is start by defining what is actually meant by a coaching culture, what is meant by culture in an organisation, and there is a separate webinar on this that you might want to have a look at, and does cover some of the theory behind this. If you have a look at Management Direct as well, there's a video on creating a coaching culture which you might find helpful. There are a number of books as well that have been written on this subject. So I've got one called Making Coaching Work, Creating a Coaching Culture, and it's by Clutterbuck and Megginson. So it's worth looking up some of those resources. So I won't spend too many words on explaining coaching and mentoring culture, just enough to give an introduction, because you want to spend most of the words actually explaining the evaluation that you've done. So you have to actually do an actual evaluation of a coaching and mentoring program that you've implemented, or if you haven't implemented one yet, to explain how you would actually go about it. So it can be difficult sometimes measuring the impact, but think about the value of coaching and mentoring to your organisation and the metrics that you might use to be able to measure this. So maybe think about things like your performance management processes, maybe appraisal systems that you could use to measure performance. Maybe think about things like absence statistics or even things like retention and levels of engagement. So you might have some statistics around these that you could use to show a difference. So we're moving on to task 2 now, and there are 5 criteria to address for task 2, and the word count is up to 650 words. So it's roughly 130 words per assessment criteria if you divide it evenly. So for the first two, 5.1 and 5.2, again join these together because they're talking about coaching and mentoring. It's the same question, but really just covering both coaching and mentoring. Here, it wants you to really think about the communication skills within the organisation and how people are currently developed. It's not about your own individual communication skills, but more around the people within the organisation. So what you might want to do is think about the personal development cycles. So how does that work in your organisation? So thinking about establishing the purpose of development, looking at development opportunities, what kind of development is offered in your organisation to support people in developing the practice of coaching and mentoring. And then how is that put into place? And then how is it measured and reviewed and evaluated? So that's one part of it. But the other part is to assess the communication skills of people within the organisation. And in the syllabus, it suggests a number of different ways that you could measure this. So it suggests things like a SWOT analysis, which you might have come across. If you've not come across a SWOT analysis before, again, this is in Management Direct, so you can read up on that and how that's done. Or in your organisation, you might have things like 360-degree feedback, or you might use performance management to measure communication skills, or there might be some feedback on your employee engagement survey that you could use. But thinking about the strengths and development areas of people generally in your organisation around the skills of coaching and mentoring. So what are the strengths, what are the development areas, and what is done to develop those approaches. When you're thinking about the different types of communication skills, don't forget to have a look at things like the EMCC coaching competencies, which do cover a number of different communication skills. And also in your coaching and mentoring handbook, which you've been given, there are lots of different areas that explain what the communication skills are that you need to be an effective coach or mentor. And for example, there's a reflection checklist in the back on page 33 that does talk about some of the different communications skills you might need around listening and questioning, providing feedback and so on. So moving on to assessment criteria 5.3, once you've established what the gaps are, what the skills gaps are around communication or around individual skills in coaching and mentoring, what you need to do then is think about what are the actual development opportunities that actually would address some of these gaps. And it's an identifier, so really you just need to explain what those different opportunities are, not in as much detail as if it was like an evaluate question. So you are essentially just identifying what they are. So in the syllabus, it's got a range of different suggestions that you could use. Obviously, just don't just copy those word for word, but some of the things you could talk about are around formal training that people might have in coaching and mentoring. It might be that they actually do some other development to help them with their communication skills. So whether that's observation or whether it's actually volunteering or project work or work shadowing or something like that. But what are the different kinds of development opportunities that people can use to help them address their development needs? So the final part of this task, 5.4 and 5.5, are around your own personal skills in coaching and mentoring. And you're asked here to evaluate those skills. So what are your strengths? What are your development areas? And then on the back of that, actually produce a personal development plan. Now, if you've not created a personal development plan before, if you go on to Management Direct, you'll find that there's a template that you can open up with a typical example of a personal development plan template, so you could use that. And usually in a personal development plan, you would outline what the skills are that you need to develop, why they might be important, how you actually going to go about it, who you might need support from, what resources you might need, and then a clear timeline for when it's going to be delivered by. And try to be specific with your timelines and make your goals and objectives SMART as well. If you're not sure about SMART, again, look that up on Management Direct. Something that might be helpful to you whilst you're producing your personal development plan and thinking about your skills and practices is to reflect on the coaching and mentoring that you've actually carried out. So you should hopefully have documented some of your reflections, so what went well, what your development areas might be, and you could use those for this part of your assessment. So moving on to the final task for your assessment, so task 3, there's actually a larger word count here. So you've got up to 1,750 words, and because there's only 5 assessment criteria, it's actually 437 words roughly per assessment criteria, and that's because you're actually having to produce some documents that would support coaching and mentoring. So you need to include a policy, procedure, and also a statement of ethics. So you do need a few more words for this. So having a look at 1.5, this is asking you to put together a set of guidelines or protocols for a program that you are implementing in your organization on coaching and mentoring. So putting together a policy or a procedure. So the things that you might want to include in there are things about what are the roles and responsibilities of coaches and mentors and coachees and mentees, what's the scope of the program, what are the boundaries, what behaviours are expected, what are the expectations around confidentiality, and so on. You can find some really good examples of these on the internet, or if you are struggling, just get in touch with us and we might be able to share some examples of policies and procedures. And then moving on to 1.6, this is on the same lines really, but what you want to do here is create a statement of ethics. And you can find a really good example of this in your coaching and mentoring handbook. And this is a global code of ethics for coaches and mentors. And as you can see, it is quite detailed. Obviously, you're not going to be able to put the same level of detail in your assessment, and we wouldn't want you to do it word for word either. But you can find this also on the EMCC website if you want to have a look at that. But the kinds of things that you could include in there are the contracting process, how confidentiality will be managed, what are the expectations around behaviours, what are the expectations around fairness, equality and diversity, and those are suggestions in your syllabus. So have a look at this, pull out the key points and then sort of rewrite it in your own words, and you'll have, like I say, around 437 words to do that. And the final task in task 3 is to create an actual implementation plan for your coaching and mentoring programs within your organization. So this may be an actual plan that you've used and implemented, or you can just create one as if you were going to implement it. And it does need to be fairly detailed, so because it's 2 assessment criteria, actually you double up the word count here, so it's 874 words roughly for the plan itself. And if you have a look on Management Direct, what you might find is some templates on different kinds of plans that you could use. But what you might want to make sure it includes is things like who's the sponsor for the project, what are your objectives, what's the resource plan, have you got a communication plan, how are you going to launch it, how are you going to actually train the coaches and mentors, how will you select them, thinking about what your milestones are as well. You may have a Gantt chart as part of that plan. So thinking about a really sort of detailed plan, and have a look at the syllabus because it does have some good suggestions on what you might include in the plan. So it's quite a practical activity to finish on. So now that we've talked about the assessment brief in detail, let's just look at some general tips on carrying out research. This is covered in one of the other assessment briefings, so if you've watched one already, then you might be already familiar with the content of this, so feel free to skip forwards, but it could be a good reminder for you of the sources that you could use. So obviously do try and use the syllabus to guide you, because there are some good suggestions on the theories that you could look up to help you with your assessment. And as I've mentioned and shown you throughout this briefing, do try and use the Management Direct website, because there's lots of good resources on there, and they're often summarised as well, so rather than reading an entire book, it might just pull out a section of a book for you. Don't forget that we've got a book list in the back of your coaching and mentoring handbook, and obviously you've got your core textbook that we provide you with, so the Connor and Pecora Coaching and Mentoring at Work, which is a really good textbook. Try not to rely on too few sources, so not just one book. You probably want to do a bit more research than that, but also don't overwhelm yourself with so much reading that you're not going to get started. Maybe what would help is perhaps just to research one topic at a time and break down your assessment so that it's not too overwhelming. One of the things I always suggest is try to avoid quoting Google and Wikipedia because we don't know whether those are reliable. What you need to do is make sure that you find a reliable and an original source. So let's talk about structure and presentation. There is a checklist for your assessment submission in your candidate handbook on page 23, and it explains there in detail what you need to include, so just make sure that you've double checked that. Try to keep your structure really logical, follow the structure that's suggested in the assessment brief, and make sure that you've got lots of headings and subheadings to break up your assessment. Try to avoid really large paragraphs and just keep one key point per paragraph, and just to make it really easy for the assessor to see how you've addressed the criteria. Feel free to use diagrams and tables throughout where it supports your work. They might be really helpful, especially when you're talking about theories and models. Sometimes they can be really useful. But obviously don't replace your word count with tables and diagrams. You do need to make sure that you've covered the main content. Do include an introduction, and that again isn't included in your word count, so your context for your organisation you can include in your introduction, and you don't need to count that as your words. You can put appendices in your assessment if you want to, but they aren't marked and they're not included in your word count. So it depends if you think they're going to be helpful. In terms of your writing style, try to not write in the first person, so using I unless you've included a reflection, and just try and keep to the point, stick to the assessment criteria, not padding out your assessment with any waffle, and just try and really keep it in plain English. And obviously don't forget to reread your work, proofread it, get someone else to proofread it if it helps, and sense check your work, and obviously spell and grammar check your work too. Just really try and avoid paraphrasing as well too closely from your external sources, not copying and pasting, because that can look like plagiarism. Obviously you can use references, you can use quotations, but using those in small amounts. And we do look at referencing in another webinar, so do have a look at that short webinar on referencing skills. So just a reminder about word counts. Do have a look at the overall word count and try and budget your word count so you know roughly how many words are needed for each section. I know the word count is tight in some places, so you can go 10% over the allowance. If you were 10% under the word count, you've possibly not done enough detail, so definitely use all of your word count. You can allow for an introduction, obviously that's separate and not included in your word count. Just make sure that, if you are budgeting your word count, so for example if it's 1,000 words for a section, you know there's 6 assessment criteria, then you're just dividing it up, it's roughly 160 words per section then. But do allow for the differences between those command words, so say if you're being asked to evaluate, there's going to be a few more words than if you were asked just to identify. Try not to use lots more words on one criterion, leaving you too few on another and running out of words at the end. Remove any repetition that you might have. And if you're over the word count, just go back and check how many words you've used for each criterion and just reduce the ones that are over the budgeted word count before you submit it. If it is massively over, what will possibly happen is that the CMI will return your assessment to you and ask you to reduce it. So just be mindful of that. There are some things that are not included, like I've mentioned, so your introduction to your organisation or your context, if you're using an index or a context page, and your headings. As I mentioned, diagrams, charts and graphs aren't included as well in your word count, and any information that you include in your references or your bibliographies, or if you are including a reflective statement, if you've been asked to do that, that wouldn't be included either. So I'm not going to cover too much on referencing here because there is a separate webinar on Harvard style referencing and should be a good reminder to you. So do have a look at that one. But just make sure that you are referencing all of your external sources, because otherwise if you're not, it can look like plagiarism, and obviously you don't want to do that. And try to use a recognised referencing system, and the one that I've suggested is Harvard style referencing that's covered in the webinar. And try to use an original source where you can, like I said, so avoiding using things like Google or Wikipedia. And there are some really helpful online tools you can use to help you with referencing. There's one called CiteMe, C-I-T-E, Cite This For Me. That's quite good, and I think it's free, so do have a look at that. And then Microsoft Word also has a really handy tool that helps you present your references correctly and helps you keep it up to date. So you might want to have a play around with that. There is also a nice handy guide on the CMI website on referencing and citations. So if you're still unsure, do have a look at that too. So we've now reached the end of the webinar. So just a quick reminder, really try and stick to your assessment criteria. Don't veer away from it. Pay attention to those command verbs, so the ones we've suggested, so things like evaluate, identify, assess, and just make sure you understand what those are asking for. Back up your work with your examples, so that can be from your own organisation but also from your wider reading. And don't forget to reference them, obviously. And use our syllabus to help you, because it gives you lots of guidance on the kind of things to include and the theories and research to look up. And don't forget to budget your word counts. And all that's left to say is best of luck with your assessment. If you do need any further help, then you can get in touch with us using the usual email address. And don't forget that we do the regular drop-in sessions if you need some extra help. So just get in touch. Don't struggle alone. We are here to help you, and I wish you all the very best with your assessment.